tonight.
We will choose to build a better future.
The world watches.
We are not seeking a new Cold War.
As President Biden seeks to reassure U.S. allies in his maiden speech at the United Nations.
We have reaffirmed our sacred NATO alliance.
After the catastrophic end of a 20-year war, a crisis over immigration, and an ongoing pandemic. Plus, the first lawsuit since Texas signed the country's most restrictive abortion law. And trillions more in spending. Congress is set for a showdown over the nation's debt limit. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
Crises and opportunities, President Biden lays out his vision of the future on the world stage. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
Good evening, I'm Jenna Browder. America is back as a trusted partner. That was part of his message in his first address to the United Nations today.
His debut at the world body comes at a time of instability at home and abroad, including Afghanistan, migrants at the southern border, flaring tensions with France, and the ongoing pandemic. CBN's Tara Mergener has tonight's top story. Tara, the Biden administration viewed this speech as a huge opportunity for President Biden.
That's true, John. World leaders gathered at the UN for the first time in 2 years. Despite mounting crises facing the Biden administration, the president insisting America is back.
The UN Secretary General kicking off the meeting with an ominous message.
We are on the edge of an abyss and moving in the wrong direction.
Although Biden used his first major UN address to reassure the world American leadership is strong while promising relentless diplomacy.
We will lead not just with the example of our power, but God willing with the power of our example.
The president hopes to repair relationships with allies after high-profile issues, ranging from Afghanistan and a U.S. drone strike that killed civilians to out-of-control illegal crossings at the U.S.-Mexico border to the COVID pandemic.
To fight this pandemic, we need a collective act of science and political will.
Critics charge Biden has been out of sync with close allies, including France, angry it was left out of plans to equip Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. During the speech, he did not mention China by name, but declared the U.S. is not seeking a new Cold War.
The United States is ready to work with any nation that steps up and pursues peaceful resolution.
He also wants immediate action on climate change.
Scientists and experts are telling us that we're fast approaching a point of no return in a literal sense.
Some global leaders remain skeptical about America's promises, calling the U.S. disloyal. While some critics say the speech was better than expected, it's unclear if Biden's words will win the world's confidence.
I don't think anything in the speech today convinced them that the Biden administration is any more prepared or capable than they thought that they might be. And if anything, it might have raised some more questions about the United States.
The Biden administration also announcing plans to ease foreign travel restrictions to the U.S. beginning in November. The U.S. has largely restricted travel by non-U.S. citizens coming from Europe since the start of the pandemic, an issue that had become a point of contention in transatlantic relations. John and Jenna.
All right, thank you, Tara. And here with us now, Sam Brownback, former ambassador at large for international religious freedom. Ambassador, welcome. I'd like to start by just getting your overall thoughts on the president's speech today.
Well, I'm afraid it was a very provocative speech in a bad way, provocative to our enemies, China. If we're saying we're going to use relentless diplomacy and not relentless war, does that invite China to say, well, let's talk about Taiwan a little bit? Does it invite other provocative moves by Russia towards Ukraine and some of its near neighbors if they think the United States is not willing to use its military might? People know that we want a diplomatic answer. They know the world wants a diplomatic answer, but a lot of times that is dependent upon their fear that the U.S. will use military strength. And it seems like President Biden was taking that off the table today.
Ambassador Brownback, the president's speech seemed to hit all the right marks. Even the heritage analyst in terror's speech kind of suggested that along those lines. He said all the right words. The question that's astutely being raised is whether there's a disconnect between what the president has said and the actions that the United States is backing up.
Well, that's my point with it. I mean, you can say we're going to use relentless diplomacy, and I think that's a fabulous line. And we all are going to use relentless diplomacy. But when you pull out of Afghanistan, when all your allies want you to stay there in a way that's not a military action of an ongoing basis, but it's more just a continuation of trying to keep the place stable, and you pull out of it, then all your allies are saying, well, you guys aren't going to be here to do the hard work that it often takes to long-term keep a place in a stable situation. And I'm afraid that's what the message that comes through in this speech is that the United States is going to pull back from some of those places that you have to be on the ground and in a tough way, often like in Afghanistan, to maintain the peace. You've got to maintain that role of the military to make your diplomacy work many times.
I mean, the president said today that we are not seeking a new Cold War in reference to the U.S. relations with China. Ambassador, though, if you have to say it, does that suggest we're already there, or at least that it's a likely conflict is a likely possibility?
Well, I think we're already in it, and I think most of the world already sees it, and they're already trying to make the calculation which team they want to be on or how do we play the middle of this game. And I think it's fine to say that we don't want a Cold War because we don't want a Cold War. But China's already at war with us. They're already coming at us. And so it's the sort of thing you can't avoid. I think it's fine what he said, but I think the reality of it is just a different situation in the world today, and that we would be better in preparing our allies and people on our side to say that we recognize that there are those that choose to go at an aggressive stance, and we will confront them in their aggressiveness. We're not going to stand by and take it and just talk about it. We will address it and we will confront it.
Ambassador Brownback, in the few seconds we have left, many may ask, with this annual tradition with the UN General Assembly, how capable is the United Nations in solving all these crises?
Oh, I think they've got a role to play, but I don't think they solved the crisis. I think they've got a role to play of coordination and of communication, and I think that's an incredibly important role. But the solving of it's going to be done by the nation states, and it's particularly going to be led by the United States, or it's not going to get done.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. Ambassador Sam Brownback, we always appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Take care. God bless.
Thank you. Well, meanwhile, the battle over abortion is getting even hotter in Texas. Republican Governor Greg Abbott now signing a law banning the use of abortion-inducing drugs 7 weeks into a pregnancy. That reporting from the Dallas Morning News. The new Texas law comes after a Justice Department investigation into another major law passed this month, banning all abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. Since then, one doctor, writing in a Washington Post op-ed, says he performed an abortion in violation of the state law. Now that doctor faces 2 lawsuits, the first known challenges under the law.
And joining us now with more, Lila Rose with the Pro Advocacy and Human Rights Group, Live Action. Lila, thank you for coming back to Faith Nation. Let's just start off with these lawsuits. Do they expose a weakness in the enforceability of the law, or do they pose a challenge to the law itself if, as written, anyone can file a claim as these 2 claimants?
Well, this was the enforcement mechanism that Texas chose for their heartbeat law because, unfortunately, if you choose the state to take responsibility, as I think the state can and must long-term for protecting preborn children, they would have gotten likely blocked by pro-abortion judges. And so having private citizens be the ones to bring civil suits against abortionists and those that are pressuring and coercing women to have abortions, it was an enforcement mechanism that thankfully has been allowed to stand in the state of Texas. And because of that, the law has been in effect for over 2 weeks now, saving over 100 children, 100 preborn lives every single day.
Well, Lila, does it represent a flaw in how it was written? And if so, what's the remedy to avoid the same scenario for the dozen or so states that have said they're looking at Texas as a template or as a model for their own?
I don't know that it represents a flaw. I mean, the fact that there will be civil suits taken against, say, this abortionist who's very publicly bragging about killing a baby with a beating heart in the Washington Post, I think that's exactly what the law is designed to do. Now it's up to individual citizens to say this is wrong and we're going to sue you for this. So I think that the mechanism is actually playing out the way it was designed to. The challenge is, of course, that long term, states have an interest. And this is what Mississippi, their Attorney General Lynn Fitch, will be arguing on December 1st before the Supreme Court in D.C. The states have a right to protect an interest in prenatal life, and they have an interest in women's health, and they have a right to pass abortion restrictions. In fact, they have a right to, I think, abolish abortion entirely to protect the basic right to life, the right to live of preborn children. So I think that's the long-term plan here, is to ensure that states can practice that protection as they do for any other born children, to make sure that they're protected under the law. But the problem, of course, is the case law on this at the federal level. Since Roe v. Wade, there's been terrible decisions from the Supreme Court that have ignored the rights of the child in the womb, and we hope that that will change with the Mississippi case in Dobbs v. Jackson next year.
Lila, is there any concern that, all of this talk of abortion lately, these laws in Texas, that it could actually backfire on the pro-life movement?
Well, I mean, certainly there is a war being waged, not just in a court of law at the Supreme Court, but in the court of public opinion. And the pro-abortion side is absolutely trying every single angle to say, there's no such thing as an embryonic heartbeat. It's not a real heartbeat. It's not a real child. This is vigilantism in the state of Texas. Texas is so backwards. I mean, clearly the pro-abortion side is riled up. They're spending millions of dollars to try to win minds to the abortion side. The reality is, though, according to Rasmussen, 46% of Americans support Texas's law, to only 43% of Americans who oppose Texas's heartbeat law. So more Americans support what Texas is doing to protect preborn children than oppose it. And we really have to look at that. That's because many Americans are pro-life. Most Americans want abortion restrictions. So despite the outrage in media, from journalists, from celebrities, from tech companies and corporate America, many Americans are actually in agreement with what Texas is doing.
All right, Lila Rose with Live Action. It's great to see you. We'll leave it there for this evening. Thank you, Lila.
Thanks so much.
Coming up, the U.S. on track to running out of money to pay its bills? How that's teeing up a congressional showdown over spending in Washington. Welcome back. A showdown is in the works as the federal government nears its cap on spending as soon as next month. 9 days from a government shutdown and a potential debt default in mid-October, Democrats are scrambling, moving to tie a short-term government spending bill together with a long-term debt ceiling suspension. Meanwhile, they're also crafting a $3.5 trillion tax and spending reconciliation bill in a bid to attach it to the already agreed-upon bipartisan infrastructure plan passed in the Senate. Senate Republicans have vowed to vote against the debt ceiling.
And joining us now, Julia Manchester, political reporter with The Hill. Julia, welcome. So Democrats, are they making a mistake here by trying to force Republicans' hands on spending? Or do you see these plans to tie a lot of this together actually working?
I think Democrats have a lot going on right now, and they have a lot on their plate. And I think this month to get this done really at the end of September is a lot for them. And you're seeing Democrats really try to walk a lot of fine lines with this $3.5 trillion spending bill. For example, the party does not appear to be unified. And you're seeing actually a lot of moderate Democrats saying, look, I don't want to support something that is that big, or they want some changes to be made. You're also seeing a lot of progressive organizations, progressive groups protesting and starting to call a lot of these moderate Democrats out. In fact, some protesters were outside of New Jersey Congressman Josh Gottheimer's house yesterday in New Jersey trying to get him to support the bill. So I don't think they're completely unified on this yet, but they have this September 27th deadline where, so they can make changes and continue to mark the legislation up. But it's a tough road ahead.
Julie, I want to ask you about one of your latest pieces of reporting for The Hill. It's called "The GOP Ramping Up Pressure on Vulnerable Democrats to Vote Against the Multi-Trillion-Dollar Reconciliation Bill." Julie, do you think that's really going to that pressure is going to move the dial for Democrats?
I don't know if it's necessarily going to move the dial. You know, talking to Democratic lawmakers and Democratic strategists in response to the story, they said, look, we're going to wait and see what happens with this bill, and that they weren't beholden to Republican interests. Though I do think what this shows, when you have all these conservative groups and committees starting to gang up on Democrats, is conservatives and Republicans are really trying to make this issue of the reconciliation bill and government spending, when we are seeing inflation going up and a labor shortage at the same time, they're trying to make this a campaign issue ahead of the midterms. So, you know, this is what they're trying to push, and they're trying to go on the record with these ads and try to get these lawmakers to go on the record with these votes so they can say, look, so-and-so, or particularly a vulnerable moderate Democrat, they can say so-and-so voted in favor of the $3.5 trillion spending package. They voted, you know, along with Nancy Pelosi. So it's a way to try to, I think, get some content for, you know, whether it's advertisements or just ammunition, really, ahead of the midterms.
Julia, in a new Iowa poll from the Des Moines Register, 62% of Iowans disapprove of how Joe Biden is doing as president. You know, Iowa, of course, the longtime bellwether of elections. Does that bode well for Democrats?
You know, I think it is a warning sign, because there are some major races in Iowa where, you know, ahead of the midterms, where you're going to see Republicans trying to tie their Democratic opponents to President Biden. There's a number of House races, a Senate race happening there. Governor Kim Reynolds is up for re-election. So it'll be interesting to see how Republicans approach this going into the midterms. But also in the presidential contest, I think you're going to see, you know, whoever ends up running for president on the Republican side really continue to bash Joe Biden and see where they can use this poll.
All right, Julia Manchester with The Hill. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Julia.
Thank you.
And when we come back, hard to see images. The White House responding to border agents rounding up migrants on horse. Welcome back. Tonight, the Department of Homeland Security is reviewing images of border agents rounding up migrants on horseback as part of a mass deportation operation. Many of the more than 10,000 migrants crowded under a bridge in the small town of Del Rio, Texas, are boarding flights back to Haiti. This after Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas denied that border agents were using whips and lassos to corral migrants. Today, Vice President Kamala Harris called the images horrible.
Human beings should never be treated that way, and I'm deeply troubled about it, and I'll also be talking to Secretary Mayorkas today about it.
And here with us now, Doris Meissner, Director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the Migration Policy Institute. Doris, welcome. We just heard Vice President Harris there responding after DHS initially denied those images. Doris, the situation in Del Rio clearly is overwhelming. Still, video of horses charging people and young kids. First of all, your thoughts on that, and then following up, as former commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, your perspective on how the White House is dealing with this crisis.
Well, those images, of course, are terribly disturbing, and they are not at all typical of what the Border Patrol does in its work, and they certainly should not be condoned. So it's important that that be stopped immediately and investigated, as the Secretary has said that it will be. The broader circumstances in Del Rio are very difficult. There's been it's a small area. It suddenly has mushroomed into a major destination point for large numbers of people quickly. The infrastructure there is not up to handling those numbers, but at the same time, the Department of Homeland Security has moved very quickly to address the circumstances, both at a humanitarian level, just food and water and shelter and sanitary facilities, and move migrants to other parts of the border so that they can be processed as well as do deportations. So the numbers that we're seeing now certainly are consistent with what DHS has said about reducing these numbers by the end of the week, and the real, effect of it all that they're seeking, which is for people to think twice about coming to that location, does seem to be setting in. That said, go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to ask you about Secretary Mayorkas and this administration. We keep hearing that the border is closed. The Secretary had a heated exchange today with Senator Ron Johnson on Capitol Hill. Why is that message not getting across to these migrants?
Well, because the border is closed, but it's also not closed. It is closed, but at the same time, there are exceptions. There are exceptions because of what the law requires and because of the vulnerability of some of the people. And when I say vulnerability, I mean young children and families and sometimes unaccompanied minors. So the exception of trying to pursue a policy that is humane, but at the same time is committed to border control, that's a very difficult policy to carry out. And that's, of course, what we're seeing and what's happening. And people, hear selectively, and they're also subject to a lot of misinformation. These are, by and large, the people coming to Del Rio are coming from South America. They're not coming directly from Haiti. They're Haitians that have been resettled for almost a decade in generally Brazil and in Chile. So
Doris,
they're getting information from the U.S. that is incorrect.
Doris, we are unfortunately out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off. Doris Meissner of the Migration Policy Institute, thank you so much for your time, and we'll be right back after the break.
Thank you.
Finally tonight, a group of penguins are on their way to recovery after battling malnutrition and hypothermia.
The Mundo Marino Foundation rescued them earlier this year, nursing the birds back to health. The penguins from Argentina and Chile spent a few months on land to develop their feathers and prepare for the chilly Atlantic until they're ready to take the plunge back into the sea. Beautiful birds.
What's the movie, Happy Feet or something like that? They're adorable.
Thanks for
Have
watching.
a great night.